USPSTF. We're going to start talking about sort of what the Preventive Task Force is and what this is all about. This is the recommendation that they came out with last October. They came out with a grade D for PSA-based prostate cancer screening. And specifically, they recommend against the service. There is moderate or high certainty that the service has no net benefit or that the harms outweigh the benefits. This recommendation, and this is important, this recommendation applies to men in the U.S. population that do not have symptoms highly suspicious for prostate cancer, meaning asymptomatic men, regardless of age, race, or family history. That's a little concerning to me. And again, we talked about that. If you're African American, you're over 65, and you have your brother and father have had prostate cancer, that would worry me to death if you're not screening these people. But that's their recommendation. So.
But due to any study for like Asian American?
Asian has actually, it's interesting because we're going to show this later, Asians actually have one of the lowest rate of prostate cancer in the world. But when Asians move to this country, their rate rises. So yes, there is likely a genetic component to it, and yes, there is likely some environmental or diet component to it as well.
It's the bacon cheeseburger.
It's the 2 bacon cheeseburgers. Exactly.
What was this group, this task force, how was it made up?
Nice, good, nice slide. That's well done. It's like I planted you there. It was made in 1984, is mandated by Congress to look at preventive measures in the U.S., why we're spending this money. It is Department of Health and Human Services select these experts, and they're the ones that pay the bills for Medicare and Medicaid, so they want to know where all this money is going to and whether they should be paying this money. That's the bottom line. They grade the quality of research by looking at all these studies. The main audience is primary care physicians because that's who basically does the majority of the preventive work. It is not a lawmaking body. They just give their recommendations. They don't make any laws. Another problem I have with the task force, and I'm assuming they do it by design, which I can understand their point, but I just don't agree with it. They're made up of 16 people. There are some physicians in it, some nurses in it, some health psychologists, epidemiologists, statisticians. They are experts in primary care and preventive medicine. That's fantastic. But none of them specialize in whatever they're studying. So in this particular task force, there was not one urologist, not one oncologist, not one radiation oncologist. In a way, maybe that's good. You take the bias out of it, because I myself have a bias of opinion, as you can see. But I would hope if you're making decisions on how this country is spending our money and whether or not we're going to be doing preventive measures, that you have experts in the field deciding this, not other people deciding. I know the leader in the task force, I think she was a pediatric cardiologist. I wanted to become a pediatric cardiologist at one point in my medical school, but whether or not she has the expertise after reading 20 studies to make determinations on screening, I don't know. I personally don't feel that's right, as I wouldn't know after reading 20 studies much about pediatric cardiology. That's my bias.
Just because they weren't on the task force, does that mean they weren't consulted?
My understanding is that this task force looked at, and there's studies that they looked at basically these amount of studies, and that's what they came about their decision.
Did they do any?
I don't think there was any consulting committee.
It's just they're reading the literature.
That's my understanding. Because most of the people that they would have consulted are very against this. So.
Did they do any hearings so they can get input from the specialists?
There was, I didn't write this down, but they left an open forum for, I believe it was 2 months to get feedback, and there was a lot of it. So they did sort of, and the reason they did that is because several years ago they came out against screening for breast cancer, I think for women under 50, and I could be wrong about that, but I think it was under 50 they came out against that, and there was a backlash, you could say. Yeah, so after that they left sort of a open-ended a period of time afterwards to get feedback.
But it wasn't a public thing where they come and listen, you had to mail it in or?
I don't believe it was sort of and maybe they had some of those, I'm not sure, but I'm assuming it was sort of a mail-in, email-in, something like that.
Dr. Blumenthal, what is the effect of that? For example, would they insurance companies no longer pay for PSA screening?
2 slides and I'll tell you.
Okay.
Okay. These are good. This is great. What this reminds me of is in whatever your political affiliation is, that's not the point, but back in February when the House committee had their discussion about whether they should pay for female contraception, and this was an all-male committee, not one female was in sight, this sort of reminds me of that, and to me that's kind of a joke. I'll address your question in just a minute. So what did they look at? They looked at articles, and that's what they gave their recommendation. That's good, that's what we do. We look at evidence-based articles. They looked at 5 screening articles. We're going to talk about 2 of them. By their own admission and their own quality standards, not one of them was good. 2 of them were fair, 3 were poor. Okay. They looked at 11 studies on treatment benefits, 16 on treatment harm. So again, 5 more skewed towards the harm. Again, only 5 of them were good, 21 were fair, and 1 was poor. This is by their own grading system. And then another 6 of them were about surgical complications. So again, kind of skewed on the bad side of the coin. What they came to conclude was that a PSA-based screening results in more prostate cancers that are detected, but it has little or no reduction in cancer-specific mortality. It doesn't save lives. That was their bottom line. Needless to say, this created quite a backlash, and the urologic community sort of responded. Dr. Marburger is the president of the European Prostate Association. And they say clearly mortality is reduced by PSA screening, but it has to be in younger and fit patients who have a life expectancy for whom slow-growing cancer can really be a threat. It's not going to help necessarily the older gentleman or sick gentleman that's not going to live for 10 years, and we'll go over that. Dr. Lacey is the American Urologic Association president. He said, we are concerned that the task force recommendations will ultimately do more harm than good to the many men at risk of prostate cancer. Until there is a better widespread test, the USPSTF, by disparaging the test, is doing a great disservice to the men worldwide who may benefit from the test. And this is where your question comes in. What does this mean? Why is this important? Not only is it important because it's out in public and patients are now saying, well, I guess I don't need this test if the US government's not telling me I don't need it, but according to the new Affordable Care Act, if this passes, that health plans are only required to cover what is rated A or B by this preventive task force. PSA testing costs $3 billion annually. Again, much of it's paid for by Medicare and Medicaid. So if it's rated D, that could affect the payment. Insurances that may say, well, I'm not paying for it anymore. Private insurances will follow, and that can drastically affect things. So down to the nitty-gritty, let's look at some of these studies that they looked at. This is sort of a schematic of PSA, and you said, well, PSA doesn't really do squat. And in one side of the coin, yeah, it's not the best test. You're looking at 100 men. PSA suggests cancer where there is none, so that would be a false positive. PSA misses these 2, that would be a false negative, and then it diagnoses it on 3. You look at that and you say, that's not the test I really want. But if you look at some of the data over the years, PSA was started in the early 90s. You can see prostate cancer rate, death rate has dropped significantly since the early 90s. Significant drop-off. 10-year survival rate back in the 70s was 53%, 98, 97%. So you can see those numbers are pretty staggering as far as survival. According to the SEER database, the SEER database is basically a database run by the National Cancer Institute about every cancer in every scenario possible. They collect everything. 41% decrease in mortality for prostate cancer from 90 to 2008. 10-year survival, like we said, increased significantly from 80% to 97% from 90s to 98.